In a previous video, and I'm not sure if it's the previous video or just simply a previous video because I don't know what order I'm uploading these videos over the Christmas holiday, I talked about Sergio Perez having the worst season relative to his World Championship teammate since Jos Verstappen in 1994, when he finished so far down compared to Michael Schumacher, because that is the stat that the biased British media has been throwing around at the minute. And even if the stats do say that Jos the Boss finished much lower down than Schumacher, which makes the claims technically correct and therefore the best kind of correct, the stats don't paint the full picture. Verstappen missed 4 races from San Marino to Canada because JJ Leto had come back from injury, and then he missed the final 2 rounds in Japan and Australia because Flavio Briatore had freed Johnny Herbert from his Lotus contract, put him in the Ligier, which he partly owned, and then put him in the Benetton to finish 1994, and Herbert would then be at Benetton for all of 1995. And while we're on the subject of Johnny, I need to look at his career in full because people like to rag on him not winning much, mostly because of that spat he had with Alonso. But when you actually learn something about him, he's lucky that he can even walk. But anyway, Perez had an absolutely horrendous season relative to Max this year, given that the Red Bull had gone completely balls up at some point in the season and he couldn't get his noggin around driving it while Max could. Because that team is built around Max and, well, Max is the much better driver of the two of them. Hence, Verstappen managed to hold on to the championship lead as Ferrari and McLaren kept taking points off each other, with Mercedes sometimes getting in on the action, while Perez had an absolute mare. As such, he's now lost his ride. But as I mentioned in that video, another driver who had an absolutely horrendous season compared to his teammate who won the championship was Heikki Kovalainen in 2008. Okay, so just one extra little bit here because I'm in the process of doing the edit. I might have pronounced his name wrong for the entire video. The pronunciation might be Heikki rather than Hecky. I never realised when I was speaking the name that I was saying Hecky. But then again, I've got one of those weird regional accents you've heard so much about. Well, I mean, sort of. It was quite thick when I was a kid, but I quickly wore it off in Lincolnshire because they're terrified of outsiders out there. It's like the village from Resident Evil 4. And I wind the accent back a bit for the video anyways, but yeah, in a black country accent, words like take, make, break, and so on become tech, mech, and breck. The film Taken, starring Liam Neeson, becomes the beat-em-up Tekken. So, by that logic, Heikki becomes Hecky. So if I do say it completely wrong for the entirety of the video, it's the accent. I can't help how I spake. Warsaw accent, eh? And before it had even begun, 2008 was going to be a tough year for McLaren, partly because of the fallout from the whole Spygate saga, after which McLaren were kicked out of the 2007 Constructors' Championship and fined $100 million. $10 million for the fine and $90 million because it's Ron, as Mosley was rumoured to have said, although I am paraphrasing. On top of this, an FIA delegate was assigned to the McLaren car to keep an eye on it, to make sure that nothing that they learned from those stolen blueprints, which were nicked from Ferrari by Nigel Stepney and then handed to Mike Coughlin, made its way onto the MP423. And then there was the absolute disaster with Fernando Alonso. Not only had Spygate rocked the whole Formula 1 and sporting world, there had been a massive spat with Ron and Fernando over various bits and pieces. Had Alonso underestimated how quick and hungry Hamilton was going to be in 2007? And other bits and pieces like that. Either way, at the end of just one single season with McLaren, Alonso had gone back to Renault, and it was Hamilton and Heikki Kovalainen for the 2008 and 2009 seasons, with Heikki coming from Renault, as it so happens. Although today, we're just going to be looking at 2008. At the same time, Kovalainen was the unofficial record holder on the Top Gear test track, because it was him and not Ben Collins, the white Stig, that drove the R25 around the Top Gear test track and set the first ever sub 1 minute lap, only for the time to be taken off the powerboard because, well, the small technicality of that car not being road legal. Heikki had come to McLaren in part due to Nelson Piquet Jr. being signed for Renault, and McLaren wasn't the primary destination, or at least wasn't a certainty because options had been explored for the Finn at Toyota. But when Alonso had announced he was leaving McLaren late in 2007, there was now an option at Toyota and also at McLaren. And given how McLaren were at the front of the grid and Toyota was doing Toyota things, such as paying mid-drivers massive money and other bits and pieces like that, the natural choice would be McLaren. There was the potential to win races and also the potential to win championships. And if you just heard my phone buzzing, it's because Walsall have just scored a second goal. Get in! So Heikki had gone from a mid-tier car to a front-running one, All being well, he should be at least fighting for the podium from the very first race, so long as McLaren kept their form going into 2008. But with Ferrari also strong in this time period, it would require any driver signing with McLaren at this point to step up their game, and there would be other teams looking for a step forward too, such as BMW, Sauber and Toyota, and with Alonso back at Renault, they could be in for some good results from time to time. Now, Heikki wasn't exactly terrible in the junior categories. A third place in British Formula 3, which was then a highly prestigious series, and then finished second at Macau the same year, this being 2002. In 2003, he moved to the World Series by Nissan, better known later on as Formula Renault 3.5, where he finished second, and then won it the following year while being the test driver with Renault. Test driver duties followed in 2005, and while in the newly renamed GP2 series, he finished second to Nico Rosberg. So he wasn't terrible, but at the same time, wasn't exactly setting the world on fire. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it would mean he'd be a useful driver to have around. He would be competitive enough, but not so competitive that it would upset the dynamic between Hamilton and the rest of the team, because they just had that horrendous season with Alonso and Hamilton, and they might have some PTSD carrying over from Prost and Senna as well. So, all things considered, Heikki was the perfect choice for McLaren. So the motorsport media, not just in biased Britain but elsewhere, wasn't expecting much from Heikki. They were expecting him to be there or thereabouts. He might pick up the occasional good result, but Hamilton was going to be the one picking up the big points and potentially making amends for the previous year, where McLaren threw it away in a pretty grand way, it has to be said. But when it came to pre-season testing, Heikki was actually not a million miles away from Hamilton, so it looked like he'd been competitive without giving McLaren another headache while trying to handle those two drivers. So how close was he in those opening races? Well, let's have a look. In Australia, Heikki set the benchmark in the first qualifying session of the three, dumping almost a full second on Hamilton and was 0.3 faster than Heidfeld and Massa, who were closely matched. But the pole position isn't settled in the first qualifying session, it's settled in the third, and Heikki ended up a respectable third on his McLaren debut, just 0.3 off Hamilton and not that far off the back of Kubica, who had taken second place. He'd got his car in front of Massa by about a tenth or so, and would have been happy to be so far in front of his old team Renault, because Alonso was 12th and Piquet was in 21st. At the start of that race, Massa had got a better start than Heikki due to being on the softer groove tyres, which were denoted by a white stripe installed in one of those grooves, and tried to make a move up the inside of turn 1. Heikki could not have given Massa any more space, and Felipe looks to have hit the curb too hard and dropped it by himself with no contact with the McLaren, and caused the Ferrari to lose a ton of positions, while at the same time clanging his front wing on the outside wall. The safety car had to come out for some other turn 1 chaos, but for the majority of the opening stint, Kovalainen was running quite well in third, but when a second safety car was called on lap 26, it was a McLaren 1-2. When the race restarted on lap 30, Kovalainen was battling with newly crowned world champion Kimi Räikkönen, but at turn 3, Räikkönen overcooked it and Heikki Kovalainen, that's a new nickname. When the race restarted on lap 30, Kovalainen was battling with newly crowned world champion Kimi Räikkönen, only for Kimi to overcook it into turn 3 and gave Heikki some breathing room. A third safety car came out later when Timo Glock crashed, and this caught out some of the drivers who hadn't made their second stops. Kovalainen was one of them, and he had to pit in this safety car period, and it sent him down the field into 7th, with Alonso behind him in 8th. Fernando got by Heikki when the McLaren sent it on Räikkönen and went a tiny bit too deep, but all in, he managed to recover after that safety car period to finish 5th. Not what he would have wanted, given that he had been in 2nd for a good chunk of the race and led a part of it, but it was just the luck of the draw with the safety car. Malaysia went a bit better, although Kovalainen had been put on the back foot. He qualified 3rd ahead of Hamilton, but then he and Hamilton were hit with grid penalties for impeding other drivers in the 3rd qualifying session. Räikkönen took the race victory ahead of Kubica, which made up for the absolute catastrophe of the race he'd had at Melbourne, while Heikki came in 3rd for a podium position. And in doing so, he managed to finish ahead of Hamilton, who came 5th, with Trulli's Toyota in between the two McLarens. More points came at Bahrain. It was a 5th place, which was starting to seem like the standard finishing position given that the BMWs were always there or thereabouts. But at Barcelona, he had a bit of a setback. On lap 22 of the race, going through the fast right-hander of turn 9, Heikki suffered a tyre failure that caused his car to go straight on at about 130 miles an hour, where he crunched the wall with a recorded impact of 26G. Heikki had been leading the race at this time and was extracted from the car and taken to a hospital in Barcelona for some proper tests, where he was determined to have suffered a concussion and suffered some general soreness, as well as having a 4-hour blackout, where he does not remember the accident or being taken to the hospital at all. The doctors cleared him to race at the next round in Turkey, but the performances from there had taken a bit of a hit, although very few of those bad performances were his fault. At Turkey, he suffered a puncture after being tagged by Raikkonen that sent him down the field to finish 12th after qualifying in 2nd. At Monaco, he had to start from the pit lane after his car stalled on the grid due to an electrical issue and was able to recover to 8th. At Montreal, his tyres were degrading much faster than Hamilton's and he had to ease off to stop him having a similar puncture to what he'd experienced at Barcelona. After impeding Webber in qualifying at Manicourt, he had to start 10th after qualifying 5th, but still managed to finish 4th. Silverstone then became a much needed boost. At this race, Heikki had scored his first ever pole position while Hamilton, who was under a lot of pressure from the biased British media, could only manage 4th. But at the start, in the wet, Lewis had launched himself up into 2nd and the two McLarens went off into the distance. But much like at Canada, Heikki began experiencing problems with his tyres. It seemed that Heikki's driving style didn't suit the car. Hamilton was driving much more on the edge, which you would think would destroy tyres, but he was able to get them to last much better than Kovalainen could. On top of this, his setup and the way he liked the car wasn't compatible with the general way the MP423 handled, and as such was getting through tyres faster than Hamilton was, even though his way of driving would suggest that Heikki's tyres would last longer than Lewis's. But despite 2 spins, and to be honest it was hard to find somebody who didn't spin that day, Heikki finished 5th. But that was the story of Kovalainen's 2008. A lot of promise, but something always had to get in the way. It's not like he was slow. But in Hungary, the luck finally went Kovalainen's way. He qualified 3rd on the grid behind Massa and Hamilton, and during the race he was promoted to 2nd when Hamilton had a puncture, because at this race it was Lewis having the tyre issues, destroying his left front on the high load corners of the Hungaroring. It looked like Heikki would have to settle for 2nd for only his 2nd podium of the season, but with a couple of laps left to run, he spotted a Ferrari conked out at the side of the road near the pit wall. It was Massa, and he'd inherited the lead, which he'd hang on to, and would score his only Formula 1 win. In an interview with McLaren.com, Heikki said that he probably should have won a race earlier in the season or got more podiums, but there was usually something getting in the way. The issues at Monaco, the puncture at Turkey, and so on. And only once, and I mean once, that season at Germany, he was told to move over for Hamilton. Moving on from Hungary into the summer break, he came 4th at Valencia, which seemed like he was back in the groove. But then he had a gearbox problem at Spa. So Monza seemed like an opportunity for another victory. But, again, it was just a podium. And the reason it's been written that way is because on the previous video talking about Perez, somebody actually said, why didn't Kovalainen beat Vettel in that McLaren at Monza? The McLaren was a much more superior car to the Toro Rosso. And, well, yeah, I used to think that too, but I learned something while putting this together. It turns out you need 4 brakes to stop a Formula 1 car. Behind the safety car at the start of the Grand Prix, one of the brakes on the McLaren became glazed, so Heikki did practically the entire Grand Prix, which was in the wet, on just 3 brakes, which would have knackered anybody's confidence in the car, especially since this was Monza in the wet. If not for that issue, then there's every possibility that the performance difference between the McLaren and Toro Rosso would have been much bigger, and Heikki could have won another race, despite missing pole through not nailing it when the weather was a bit drier. As Heikki put it, it was another missed opportunity. In Singapore, he was punted off by Kubica and finished out of the points. In Fuji, his car conked out. In China, McLaren fitted his tyres the wrong way round and the car wouldn't turn in. When he stopped for new tyres, they were put on the right way round, and he had what he described as the best car he'd ever had. But then the pneumatics failed. But in Brazil, Heikki did his bit, holding up Timo Glock in the early part of the race. Did that contribute to the last lap, last corner moment? Hard to tell, but Heikki likes to think that he did his bit. So was he as bad as the results say? I'm going to say no. He wasn't as bad as those results say. His driving style and the way he wanted the car set up weren't exactly compatible with the car. With Hamilton being the one most likely to win the championship, the upgrades were going to be based around him, and when the upgrades worked, it gave Hamilton even more of an edge on his teammate. As we saw with Perez this season, when the car suited him, he was right at the pointy end, but when it went wrong, it showed. At the same time, Heikki wasn't finishing in lower points paying positions or out of the top 10 or whatever because he couldn't wheel. It was because there was, more often than not, stuff happening beyond his control. And after his smash at Barcelona, it's understandable if he was driving with a bit of caution for a bit. The opening few rounds of the season showed what he was capable of, and at Turkey he was overtaking cars to get his way back up through the field, so it was clear that he could, as the kids would say, wheel. In the practice sessions, he wasn't too far off Lewis. It just seemed that the luck kept on going against him. Where would he have finished if he had the same reliability as Lewis or not been biffed off on a couple of occasions? There's every possibility, especially with BMW falling off as they did after Canada, that Heikki could have been fourth behind Massa, Raikkonen and Hamilton. Which sounds about right to me. I mean, yes, he was most likely always going to be outpaced by Hamilton. Hamilton was also Ron Dennis's pet project, so Ron was going to be all Hamilton, while Martin Whitmarsh tended to be Heikki's guy at the team. David Coulthard once told F1 Racing magazine that Ron sometimes wouldn't even look at you over the course of a race weekend, which probably explains why Martin Whitmarsh was Heikki's cheerleader. And with all of those dropped points, McLaren didn't win the Constructors' Championship. They came second instead, and it would have been their first Constructors' Championship since 1998. Instead, they'd have to wait until this year to get their first championship since 1998. But I'll leave it to you to have a discussion about. Was Heikki really that bad, or was he just a victim of circumstance or just a victim of bad luck? Personally, I think it was just bad luck. I mean, he was pretty quick. I mean, he wasn't terrible, and he would have been a solid number 2 for Lewis through the course of 2008 and probably could have helped McLaren win the World Championship. But, you know, I just think that it was wrong place, wrong time for him at that time, if that makes any sense. But again, I invite you to have a discussion about it down in the comments. So then, a look at Heikki Kovalainen's 2008 season, and if he and it were really as bad as we remember him or it being. If this has taught you something new or made you reconsider your memory of that year, then do leave a like on this video so I know I've done a good job. And for more like this from the channel, hit the subscribe button and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help keep the lights on around here, a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and there's memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.